Hi there, welcome to this session. Thanks for coming. We'll just wait a few more moments for other people to join. Hi, I see we still have people joining us. I'll just wait a few more seconds and then I'll begin our session. Okay, I'm going to start. Thank you very much for joining and welcome to Protecting Civic Space, a global discussion. This event builds on the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC's, Under the Mask programme, which is investigating the exploitation of COVID-19 to restrict civil society. And within the conference, we're part of the Define section. So we're currently defining ways in which civic space can be protected. I hope this is an interactive session and that you'll help make it lively. My name's Lucy Roberts and I've been working with AFSC for the past 7 years, 5 of them as Asia Regional Director. And for the last 2 years, I've been working as a consultant and looking specifically at the area of protecting civic space. We recognise that an active civil society is critical for a healthy and rights-based society. So I think we've probably all observed a global trend of tighter restrictions on civil society over the past 5 or 6 years. I certainly saw that in my work, and in many countries we've seen the introduction of new NGO laws with tighter controls. Now, with the arrival of the COVID pandemic, we've observed further restrictions on civic freedoms to assemble, associate, and to express itself. Many actions are legitimate attempts to curb the spread of the pandemic, but we've also seen excessive responses where people have been imprisoned for dissent, police brutality has been deemed necessary, and increased surveillance of citizens has been justified by states. I'd like to welcome our speakers who have direct on-the-ground experience of these measures and also have observations of creative and positive steps civil society has taken to protect its space. We have Theresa Mar, who is a qualified mediator and founder of and director of Peace Generation, a civil society organisation whose mission is to foster sustainable peace in Hong Kong. Before entering the peace building field several years ago, she was a lawyer focused on complex corporate transactions. Ruki Fernando is a human rights activist from Sri Lanka based in Colombo. He supported national and international campaigns and advocacy, advancing civic space. He has documented rights violations and he protects human rights defenders and journalists at risk. We also have Sahar Vardi, who's the Israel Programme Coordinator in the Middle East region for AFSC and is a peace activist who has served 3 prison sentences for her refusal to be conscripted into Israel's military service. Her work has been recognised by the Nobel Women's Initiative. Kennedy Akolo is Regional Director Africa for American Friends Service Committee and a development practitioner with over 20 years experience. With AFSC, Kennedy provides strategic and creative leadership to lay groundwork for long-term peace with justice. We also have Debbie Ball with us, AFSC consultant, and she is managing the chat feature. And Libby Chase is our note taker. Now, after the presentations, we'll have a Q&A. So please share any questions, suggestions, links in the chat as we go. And if you want to add your email address, we'd like to keep in touch with you. So please do so. Now, to go on for our presentations, first we'll hear from Teresa. Hong Kong was promised a high degree of autonomy when it returned to Chinese sovereignty, but the Chinese central government is accused of breaking this promise. Hong Kong mainland tensions have led to many violent clashes between protesters and the police for more than a year. Now, Teresa can tell us more about how civil society is managing during the pandemic. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you, Lucy, and good local time, everyone. I'm going to be slightly more upbeat, and we'll begin by telling two stories on the use of space by Hong Kong civil society. First of all, the use of advertising space in international media. So less than 2 years ago, the Hong Kong government wanted to introduce a law to extradite criminal suspects from Hong Kong to mainland China. So in a single day, 2 million people marched against the law, but the government refused to back down. As this was happening, G20 government heads were preparing to meet in Osaka. So suddenly, full-page advertisements headlined, Save Hong Kong at G20, Stand with Hong Kong at G20, with eye-popping designs started to appear in major newspapers in G20 countries. So you can see it's the New York Times, the Guardian, the Globe and Mail, etc. The advertisements were not just in English, but they also appeared in Korean, in German, Japanese, French, Italian, plus others. They called on G20 citizens to share Hong Kong's concerns with their governments, because the government heads would be meeting with their Chinese counterpart at the G20 summit. Well, what was so remarkable about the campaign? It started as an idea of a few individuals, so decision and execution were quick. The campaign then gathered public support through crowdfunding. They raised $900,000 US in just 9 hours. There was also a multiplier effect. By using mainstream news media, the advertisements themselves became news. So use of the G20 summit elevated the extradition issue to the international relations arena and caught the attention of world political leaders and the financial markets. The result? The Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry warned that the Hong Kong issue must not be discussed at G20. However, some G20 leaders did raise the matter, and about 10 days after the G20 summit, the extradition bill was declared dead by the Hong Kong government. To keep up international attention on the issue, which then lasted for many, many more months, there were 2 more rounds of media campaigns, as you can see, involving more countries and more languages. My second story is about the use of public space. When people think about Hong Kong, what comes to mind are shiny, tall buildings all pressed together. In fact, 75% of Hong Kong is green, and we have over 100 mountains. The most iconic mountain is Lion Rock. It is, as you can see, shaped like a resting lion and can be seen from many, many areas across the territory. The Lion Rock has been the backdrop for a lot of protests. Hikers have draped massive banners with slogans on the lion's head. The scenes are very dramatic, and very few news agencies could resist publishing them. This way, the slogans get a lot more media coverage. On another occasion, a group initiated a night hike. So the hikers carried lamps to light their path. As people walked along the trail that formed the lion's head and the lion's back, they created a shimmering silhouette of a lion looking over the city. So the organizers used an iconic public space and gave it a new twist. The result was a beautiful but fresh image that kept Hong Kong in headlines. The event required very little money. Participation was more important. Actually, because it took place at night, office workers and whole families could join. And because of the open space, all sorts of people took part in the event. So until recently, I wanted to really share the stories because the conference concept note says something. It refers to small emerging possibilities that hold the prospect for large sweeping changes. In my stories, the small possibilities were created by the bedrock of civil society. And I meant individuals who share their skills and use them to mobilize others. Until recently, the challenge for Hong Kong civil society is this: how do we continue making creative use of space? With COVID, access to physical space and the right of assembly have shrunk. On top, there is more surveillance, more intrusion in privacy, less legal protection of personal data. It also means greater reliance on digital communication. So to safeguard this particular space, some civil society groups are updating themselves about information technology, upgrading their data protection and cybersecurity practices, looking for vulnerable areas and fixing them. They're adopting greater discipline in the use of passwords, creating more secure passwords, being more careful when using public Wi-Fi networks, switching to messaging platforms with end-to-end encryption and auto-deletion. Now, these measures apply to both work and personal devices. Today, the challenge is even more different. It's not just about making creative use of space. With the pandemic not going away soon, and with a new, very tough national security law in place, Hong Kong civil society is having to ask how we can hold on to space and how we can direct creativity towards making new space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and we'll be coming back to hear more from you during the questions and answer session later. Now I move to Ruki. Sri Lanka has a checkered history in terms of civil rights, with peaks and troughs over the past 10 years since the violent end of the civil war. Ruki will share an overview of the situation of civil society now under COVID restrictions. Welcome, Ruki.
Thank you. So in terms of civic space, till about 2014, there was a lot of restrictions on civic space. Human rights activists, journalists, lawyers, and others who are critics of the government faced a lot of intimidation and threats. But with the last few years, it got a bit better under a new government. But since this year, again, there has been increasing intimidations and threats to lawyers, journalists, activists, but also overall to civic space and to organizations. A particular example of that is the police taking court orders to stop events that are critical of the government or perceived as being critical of the government. This has happened in different parts of Sri Lanka, in the capital Colombo, in Jaffna, in the north, in Batticaloa, in the east. But when there were such restrictions, there were occasions where people who faced the restrictions went back to courts, challenged it in courts, and managed to get it lifted, or at least partially lifted. At least one group in the east decided to defy it and to march on the street anyways. And in the end, they were successful and the police could not stop them. And this was mostly a group of women who were mostly families of disappeared people in Sri Lanka. So this has been one like a tactic that the people had used to counter court orders. Another, I think, a major fear right now at the moment is in terms of changing laws with non-governmental organizations. There was an attempt to change it to bring about more monitoring and scrutiny in 2018, but we had a big public campaign, and we also met the minister in charge at that time and also the prime minister, and then the prime minister agreed to withdraw the proposed amendments at that time. That was 2 years ago. Now it's a bit different, and now there's a fresh attempt to bring those restrictions on NGOs and restrict civic space. But although it's a more hostile environment, we have still continued to engage with government authorities. I think one of the things that we try to ensure is that we have a big constituency, that we have consultations across the country with different civil society groups, and also making sure that everyone is updated about what's going on, and also to have a committee to engage and dialogue with the government that is representative in terms of issues that they work on, but also in terms of geography, gender, etc. We also had worked on a small group, had worked on a kind of alternative draft of what could be a law on freedom of association, and we had submitted it to the government, hoping that some of the points that we had made will be taken into consideration. And at the same time, I think human rights defenders across the country have been conscious of the difficulties they might face in the coming years. And there has been a process of reviewing and reflecting about security practices and policies of individuals and also organizations. When we are traveling, when we are organizing events in relation to communication, in relation to the security of data, and a variety of things. And I think there has been some planning being done across the country by individuals and groups based on a principle that that we should not panic, but we should be prepared to carry forward our work in a way that will ensure that we are also not harmed and people we work with are not harmed. So I think I will stop here and maybe I will share more in the general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruki. Good to hear your report there. Our last presentation comes from Sahar. Palestine, Israel, as we know, has a long history of repression and conflict, and Sahar can give us a snapshot of the current situation for her fellow citizens during the pandemic, living in a country known for its high-tech surveillance mechanisms. Welcome, Sahar.
Thank you. So, as Lucy said, I think it's important to, before we really talk about Israel, important to say and recognize that when we talk about the Israeli context, we're talking about a context in which Israel also holds millions of people under military law in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. And it's important when we talk about the kind of restrictions on civil space within Israel that we mention that, because a lot of the tools that are used for restricting civil space within Israel are tools that are first and foremost used to restrict civil space of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So I'll speak mostly about surveillance, and there it is important again to say, so right now phones, cameras, drones are all used for surveillance on a regular basis in the occupied territories, with a lot of Israeli companies including NSO, Elbit Systems, some very big international Israeli companies that are doing a lot of this surveillance and developing systems to do that on Palestinians. And then a lot of these same systems are then exported around the world. So we've seen Israeli spyware that was developed by ex-intelligence soldiers here in Israel, then used against journalists, against human rights activists in Mexico, in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia. We've also seen Israeli drones used, again, developed for surveillance here, used in Azerbaijan now on the Mediterranean Sea against migration. So we're really seeing like these forms of surveillance that start with the occupation here and then affect other places in the world. And it's not very surprising that currently with COVID, they're starting to affect the community here as well and to be used against Israelis. And so since COVID, we have had contact tracking, so it's a phone surveillance, phone location surveillance started by the Israeli security services on all Israelis. That is using a lot of the same companies that do the same in the West Bank and in the occupied territories. So just as an example of what that means when these companies adapt. So for instance, there are cameras by a company called AnyVision that historically were used mostly to monitor Palestinians. Today, there are cameras that include not only facial recognition, but also heat recognition. And so they are placed in hospitals within Israel, and there's talk about placing them within schools and workplaces. So the pandemic and the real health crisis creates an opportunity to add these surveillance systems into civic space in a way that today might be used mostly for the pandemic, but it is a question of how will it be used in the future when we have facial recognition systems deployed in school and workplaces in different places, beyond also, as I said, the phone surveillance that we have at the moment on Israelis as well as on Palestinians. There's a few different examples, but we won't go into all the detail about it because it is important to talk a little bit about what is being done against that as well. And I think it's interesting to state that the first thing that was done in Israel to try to mitigate this state surveillance around COVID was a Supreme Court case. And that Supreme Court case failed. And I think it's actually very interesting. And today the tracking of phone location is legal. And the reason that is interesting is that historically they used to say that the Israeli Supreme Court was extremely progressive on issues of rights and human rights until it reached the green line, until it reached the line of occupation and started affecting Palestinians. And I think it's an interesting moment because what we're seeing is really how that Supreme Court stops being a protecting system also to Israeli citizens, and that line of the green line, the division between occupied territory and Israel is really becoming more blurred. The other thing that a lot of activists are doing is really, as Teresa said in Hong Kong, a lot of cybersecurity training. So moving to applications like Signal that have end-to-end encryption, turning phones off, growing awareness of what that electronic surveillance looks like. But another kind of a digital thing that has happened is that right now I'm talking to you in a second lockdown in Israel. We're currently in the second wave lockdown. And this lockdown has interestingly been much easier on most things, like in other countries in the world. It's not as strict as the first one, except for protests. It's actually been much worse on protests and has not allowed protests beyond 1 kilometer from your house. And the interesting thing that happens with that, and this was the state trying to prevent mass protests that are happening at the moment against our prime minister for corruption. And the interesting thing that happened with that is at the moment that happened, there's been mass protesting in that 1 kilometer parameter that has been organized through the web, through websites that would connect you to your neighbors, and have brought out over 200,000 people to protest. That's about 2.5% of the population, just so we understand the scale that we're talking about. And I think that both shows us some of the opportunities and what civil society can do with the restrictions, and many times in reaction to these restrictions. But I think the other interesting thing that is happening here, and this is an opportunity I'd really be happy to talk about, how do we develop, is really the awareness and the conceptual opportunity, which is that people have started to see now that these surveillance systems are also used against Israeli citizens. They're starting to break that idea that, you know, you should only be against surveillance if you're guilty, right? You have no reason to be against it if you're not guilty. And now people are starting to kind of wake up to the idea of, well, there is actually value of privacy in it of itself, and kind of expanding that conversation and making the connection between things that Palestinians have been really arguing against for years in this breach of privacy and other forms of state violence. But now finally Israelis are also seeing it, and it's interesting to see how those connections are slowly being made and being able to have a conversation on a broader level that starts talking about the occupation within Israeli context as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sahar. And thanks to the three speakers for those interesting reports from their experience and their countries. I think, you know, we can see that there have been restrictions that predate the pandemic for sure, but they're being exacerbated at the moment. And it sounds as if civil society is really utilising social media. Now, before we move on to the question and answer session, I'd really like to have some feedback from you. So we've got three poll questions. The poll will come up in your screen now, and I'd really appreciate it if you can give your answers and we can just hear what you see your government actions as, if they're genuine, if they're justified. And this is anonymous for your information. Okay, so 100%, not quite 100%, but we've had a lot of increases in control of civil society during the pandemic. It seems as if they're split between the feeling that they're genuine to control the spread of the pandemic, or maybe not going further than necessary. And it's great. That's great to see that you feel so positive about opportunities for civil society to remain active. I'm really pleased to see that. Okay, thanks. Thanks for taking part in that. That's useful. Now, we've got about half an hour for questions and answers. Please write any questions that you have for either all the panelists or a particular panelist in the chat, and I will pass your questions on. But first of all, I've got one question for Kennedy, who didn't actually present, but as Regional Director in Africa, he specifically got some insights into Zimbabwe, well, a number of countries, and Kenya, of course. I just wondered, Kennedy, what do you think are some of the most effective ways civil society has been harnessing its potential to maintain civic freedoms in the countries that you're engaged with?
Thanks so much, Lucy. Just like all other countries across the board, I think Africa has not been left behind. And specifically for Zimbabwe also, it continues to experience lots of these excesses by government. I think the challenges have been there, but as Lucy put it, this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just want to add that maybe to bring this home very clearly, what we've seen a lot in Zimbabwe is arrests, detention without trial for civil society activists, journalists and opposition politicians. Maybe two political prisoners who represent, the repressiveness of the regime. Two individuals that I'll mention, that is Hopewell Chinono, who is a journalist, was imprisoned in July, and Jacob Ngaruvime, who is also an opposition leader and who have been detained with leg irons, denied bail, visits, private visits with their lawyers, food, and also no adequate C19, that's COVID-19 protection at all. So that's the way it is right now, but there's so many other challenges in Zimbabwe. But so how are civil societies trying to maintain, the freedoms and continue supporting the cause? I'll just mention a few which have been mentioned also by my colleagues, but what I'm seeing for countries like Zimbabwe again is usage of regional and international media platforms to tell the story of the crisis in Zimbabwe. And I think it's also recognizing that the local media is very much controlled. It's really difficult to get anything around or acts of dissent being published in the local media. So a lot of awareness by civil society organizations are being raised, using media in South Africa and other known international media houses, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, and others. So maybe something else that I just want to mention is collaborative working. So civil society working collaboratively and building alliances. So you have to look at very key alliances that you want to build. And one that I want to mention here is especially working very closely with the churches. And the reason why civil society is working close with the churches is that the churches in a country like Zimbabwe enjoy both regional and international support. They have the structures, and I just want to say that they are also trusted conveners and their voices carry the authority. And I'll say that, of course, it's not all churches, because there are also churches that are extremely pro-state. The other thing that I just want to mention also is civil society is also standing with in solidarity with each other. This is, statements of solidarity. So when like the Catholic Church really talked about the specific issues that ail the government at the moment, there was, of course, it faced a lot of backlash from the government, but immediately, a lot of civil society are coming in, to stand in solidarity with the Catholic Church and just be part of that movement. The other one is really appreciating that also there's an opportunity to mobilize the diaspora, the Zimbabwe diaspora, so that they are able also to raise these things at a global issue, wage actions at embassies, use their freedoms, to raise awareness on the crisis and challenges that are faced by civil society actors in the country. So all these are coming together at the creative ways that CSOs are trying to maintain its freedoms and also stand for one another. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks, Kennedy. Really, really interesting. Thank you. We've got a question for Ruki. Ruki, how do activists in Sri Lanka reach out to people in remote areas, not always literate? Thanks.
So I think in Sri Lanka is relatively a small country, and I think in almost we have 25 districts, and almost in every district there are some civil society groups who are organized. So that doesn't mean that someone from the capital has to always be there for them. So there are local groups that are, some of them have been there for a long time. There are also groups of communities that are affected who are organized themselves to struggle for justice. Like there are victims, families, and survivors groups who are organized. So often people from capital and people from different districts and provinces meet together and communicate with each other so that there are collaborative working arrangements. But a lot of activism on local issues happens by local activists themselves. And there are also others who can support that, like journalists who are locally based. There are some religious leaders who are, like Kennedy said, some Christian clergy and some other religious leaders who are supportive of struggles. There are lawyers who are there in almost all the districts who are supportive of struggles for justice. So I think they all help to keep some civic space, resistance, defiance open.
Thanks, Ruki. Great. We've got a question from Sweta. Hi, Sweta. Good to see you here. Have the panelists seen any innovative ways of challenging restrictive practices of the state in the time of the pandemic? And has there been any unlikely allies emerging? How can we harness these? I'll go first to Sahar on this, because she did speak a little bit about how, there were some joint efforts between Israel and Palestine on opposing the restrictions. And then I'll go to Teresa. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that as far as really the kind of new alliances that are growing, it really, we have seen this in the current mass protest movement that's happening, is that there are voices really trying to push to make this about kind of wider issues and more structural issues. I just need to clarify, currently there's a protest movement in the country that focuses on the corruption of the Prime Minister. And I think that for many groups within Israel, that corruption is just one more layer, and the issues are much more structural, racial violence, structural violence, and things of the sort. And what happened with the pandemic is that people really saw how the state is using the pandemic to restrict protests because they're anti-government, to oppress specific groups, including the people organizing these protests. And so the alliances that have been built are really about kind of, through that police violence and state violence against protesters now in the time of pandemic, being able to talk about that oppression more widely. And so groups like Ethiopian Jews or Mizrahi Jews, who have been much worsely affected by police brutality for decades, and groups like Palestinians who have done the same, those alliances are starting to be built. But I also want to be cautious and say that is a long process, and we need to make sure that we're not using one struggle for the other, or not forcing it, but actually making this genuinely alliances, but they are growing. I also want to say, just for kind of more creative, innovative ways of protesting with COVID restrictions, beyond some that have already come up, one of the ones that has been used here a lot are Zoom protests that are not only bringing together people on Zoom that would have joined a protest, but actually screening those Zoom calls, including the volume, like the actual sound of them, near the house of the person you'd want to protest. So you can bring literally hundreds of thousands of people without anyone leaving their house, and no issues around mass gatherings. And you can bring their voices actually there as well. And there's kind of trying to think about more creative ways of how to care about public health and at the same time continue protesting in different ways.
Thanks, Sahar. And Teresa, would you like to add anything here? Otherwise, there are lots more questions. I'm not sure if we'll get to them all. Teresa.
So, I mean, very similar to what Sahar has been sharing. So I'll give two examples. So one group of women leaders of NGOs actually started very, very early on to band together and actually created a webinar for all their donors, because they could see that money that had been reserved for their sectors had actually all gone into fighting the pandemic. So that solidarity was refreshing, but also quite rare in the old days. A second thing is that some members of civil society have started organizing book reading clubs online, so that they could actually both educate themselves and give time to look at things with a cooler head and share information and stay connected at the same time. So these book clubs have been amazing.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. It's from Leanne, and she's asking what the presenters see as a role for international organisations and foreign donors. She says those that often provide vital funds for local civil society organisations in protecting the space for civil society. And Ruki, I thought I'd come to you with this question to start with, because we also had talked about international advocacy and work with donors and international organisations. Thanks.
So this is a very complex question. I think there are, when we say international, there are foreign governments who have been supportive of civic space, who have supported human rights defenders at risk through their embassies in the country, like in Colombo in the case of Sri Lanka. They have different guidelines, like the EU guidelines on human rights defenders, the Norwegian guidelines, the Swiss guidelines. So some of those diplomats have been helpful in protecting civic space. And also another dimension is the intergovernmental organizations, like particularly the United Nations. So in the past, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Assembly, Association on Human Rights Defenders have taken up cases from Sri Lanka, and I think this has been helpful. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN has also been helpful in taking up cases, highlighting issues internationally. And so that's another dimension. The third one that was specifically mentioned was donors. A lot of Sri Lankan NGOs are dependent on foreign donor money to carry on their activities. And I think some donors in the last few months have been asking and been expressing concern about security of their beneficiaries, and they have allocated the money for beneficiaries to train themselves in terms of dealing with the threats that have been coming up. And I think from the donors, is important to have some degree of flexibility, because sometimes in order to maintain the space and to be safe, human rights defenders and civic groups may want to change their priorities in changing situations. And I think it's important that donors are flexible to that. It's also important for donors to be considering funding informal groups, because it's not always possible to register with the state apparatus, particularly when the state is seeking to use that kind of a registration to scrutinize and to monitor and to harass civic organizations. So these are just some thoughts.
Thanks, Ruki. I won't go to each panelist to respond to each question. I want to be able to share all the questions we have, but at the end, any panelists that would like to add to something, I'll give you a chance to share any closing comments. So we've got an interesting question from Abdul Rahman in Sudan. And his comment and question is that he's observed, you know, a struggle to preserve civic space in Sudan, and now the voice of the people is becoming divisive. So he says, sowing polarization, tribalism, and a lack of respect for the other. So he's asking if the panelists or anyone in the audience, so please do type into the chat if you have anything to add, are noticing this in their contexts. So I'm not sure if you've seen the freedom to civil society becoming divisive in your countries. I'll go to Kennedy first. Thanks, Kennedy.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks for that particular question. Yes, we have to appreciate that the government is one of the key players in all these issues. So what happens is also that the governments take advantage and try to divide the civil society. It is for their own good that civil society doesn't stand as one. And we've seen in some instances where the government also sets up their own civil society, which sort of come out to counter what the other civil society organizations are doing. We're also seeing that even within the churches, sometimes you also get those religious bodies that are really pro-government. And I think the aim is to really create a rift amongst the civil society players. That has happened a lot in so many of the African country setups. The whole agenda, and I think one of the messages that we keep on hearing from governments here, especially in relation to INGO, that's the international NGOs, is that they represent a regime change agenda. That's what we hear a lot here, and because of that, that's part of the government system, you know, trying to create that rift between civil society amongst themselves and within the areas of operation. So I think it is important that civil society are very clear. The other thing that I just want to mention is that if there's an opportunity really to build the capacity of those local civil societies so that they're able to identify these specific issues and be able to address them at that very localized level, I think is a very great opportunity. But yes, those challenges are there and we need to be aware of where they're emanating from. Thank you.
Thanks, Kennedy. Teresa, I wondered if you have anything to say on this question. Have you noticed divisions within civil society, polarizing views?
Yes and no. I think it's actually, the experience in Hong Kong has more be on the side of people being generous with their knowledge and help. Both, I mean, I mentioned knowledge, but also in terms of materials and, you know, trying to put our heads together to reckon with what is going on here. I should give a little bit of context. So a few weeks ago, we were supposed to have had our legislature council elections, which is like the general elections in a country, but we're only a city. Takes place once every 4 years. So very, very early on, the government actually canceled the elections. And it was going to be, the anticipated result included the possibility of a change in majority. So people who were actually spending time campaigning in the elections actually all of a sudden found that they were without a job. And a lot of people, I understand, experienced depression as a result. And so we're still in a way reckoning with a lot of the things that are going on and what the implications are. And even now, we do not have a date for the new elections. And this is for the legislature.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm going to hand over to Sahar. What have you observed on this, Sahar?
Well, I think I just wanted to add a couple of things to that. First is something that actually activist I was speaking to in India a few months ago pointed out very, very well, was that when we keep talking about shrinking space of civil society, and then that is actually possibly a problematic term, because what we're seeing in most of our contexts is a shrinking space for specific kinds of civil society or a specific side of the map of civil society. And it's not really done necessarily only by the state, right? So this dichotomy that saying shrinking space of civil society creates is this idea that the state is shrinking the space of civil society. Well, what's actually happening is right-wing nationalist governments shrinking the space of resistance to that, right? And I think it is important to state that, because then it means, yes, actually a lot of the shrinking of civil space comes from civil space. We've had protests in the last few weeks being attacked by right-wing civil society actors, right, citizens from the street, and then the government supports that, and they support the government, but it's not a state versus civil society. And I think we maybe need to think more about the language that we're using, and maybe start saying it's a restricting of, and this is where we lose language. What are we talking about? Kind of more liberal perspectives, kind of more left perspectives. All these words have so much baggage on them that we don't want to say them. But in effect, that's a bit of what's happening. And I think we really need to think about language in that way. And the same happens with, freedom of expression, as again, the question did mention this use of freedom of expression against us in many ways, to say that, and we see that with fake news, and we see that with extremely racist, sexist, whatever kind of language that is coming out from the extreme right, to say that's not what freedom of expression is, right? Incitement is not freedom, like to limit and say, we need to redefine some of these things, because in many ways our language, the language of freedoms, of human rights, is being used by anti-human rights and anti-freedom bodies at the moment, but they're using that language, and we really need to clarify how we don't allow that to continue.
Thank you. Yeah, Abdulrahman, true. It's complicated, and maybe we use abbreviations. We use the term civic society too generally, as Sahar's saying. And now, this session is looking at defining the activities that civil society can undertake to protect their space. And as we make the definition, we should really be aware of the complexities, and absolutely. Now, there's not a long time left for our session, so I think what I'd like to do is just give each of the panelists 1.5 minutes to share anything you feel that you'd like to say that you haven't had a chance to, or respond to any of the questions that I didn't direct to you that you have something to comment on. So I think first we'll go to Teresa, and then Ruki, and then Sahar, and then Kennedy for some closing observations. Okay, thank you.
First of all, really just wanting to thank everyone for participating, because I do feel, as a member of civil society, however Sahar defines it, I like to be seen to be part of that. To be able to talk across physical barriers and divides, and to show each other support. I do hope, though, that we will, in continuing to connect in this way, start to have greater sensitivity in relation to each context, so that we can help each other better. Because just from hearing the range of experiences that people have, we can see that first of all, there's been a shrinking of civil society space globally, but also people are ingenious and can actually find very, very interesting ways of combating. And the more we're engaged with each other, the sort of stronger and more resilient civil society will become. And I did particularly appreciate Sahar's comment about how broad the term civil society can be. And I must say I lapse sometimes, and I do want to just express appreciation for reminding us of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your thoughts there, Teresa. Ruki, have you got any closing comments that you would like to make? Just if you could keep it to a minute or so, that would be great.
Okay. So I also share the sentiment that civil society is very broad, so we can include artists, we can include professionals like lawyers, journalists, and I think importantly we must also include survivors of violence and human rights violations, families of victims, and people, communities who are affected. And I think that will broaden our understanding of civil society if we include all of this. At the same time, we have to be very careful, I think, because some groups that are aligned with repressive states are also calling themselves civil society. Groups that are ethnically, religiously has very extremist views also call themselves civil society. So we have to be very careful about having them. The last comment that I would make is also the importance of solidarity at local, national levels with survivors, victim families, and affected communities. And that is also very important at international level. And I think I have also benefited from such international solidarity personally and for many of my colleagues in Sri Lanka. So I think it's a give and take. At certain times, we may need more support and solidarity, and at certain times, we may be able to extend more solidarity to others internationally. So thank you for inviting me also to share some thoughts.
Thanks, Ruki. I really appreciate your comment on international support and exchange when it's needed. Let me hand over to Sahar for any last comments you might want to add, Sahar.
Well, I feel I'll be repeating a lot of what's been said already, but really I do think that these conversations are, for me, extremely interesting. I'm very grateful for everyone who has spoken here, including the questions, which I think kind of make us rethink things very much so. And I think many times having these conversations really wakes us up to our own blind spots because we're so much in our context and have all the answers. And within our context at the moment, we ask questions beyond them. It really allows us to kind of see some of those blind spots. And I think really is possibly a good place for building that language that is an alternative to the words that currently might not exactly define what we're actually talking about, and really thinking, how do we, I mean, maybe this is kind of an invitation or a challenge for us all of thinking, how do we together build a language that really fits our needs, that is exactly what we're talking about, and that can't be co-opted by the people actually doing the exact opposite of trying to restrict our spaces and restrict societies. And that would be, yeah, maybe that's an invitation to us all to try to think of how to work together to create a language that really works for us.
Thank you very much. And then I'll go to Kennedy to add any other points that you'd like to add. And then we'll go on and we'll just take out some key observations on what we've heard today and what we've been discussing. Kennedy, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I think a lot has been said around civil society. What I can add is there's need for continued conversations on this. As somebody did observe, I think in the chat, this is a very complex issue. I think the more we have the opportunity to be able to share across the board, the context might differ a little bit because we've seen situations where civil society actually are almost the opposition in those countries because the government finds its way of manipulating opposition. So we have to be very careful that we continue providing those opportunities for lessons, drawing lessons from one another. We need to look at who else, can come in very, very critically. I also just want to highlight maybe the issue of the role of the donors, because many of the civil society organizations that we talk of, for instance, in the African context, really struggle so much. And without that funding, I think they'll just fizzle out. So we need really to look at a donor community that is also very flexible enough, to be able to support the efforts of civil society to continue doing what they have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kennedy. And, I wanted to ask, I don't know if you're prepared, Kennedy, but we talked about you maybe making some of your key takeaways from the session. Do you have any observations you could share with us now briefly?
Yes, Lucy. So what I can observe also from the discussions that have been taking place is that the civic space and civic liberties are shrinking globally. I think that has come across, and I think we have to appreciate that the oppression of civil society right now is a global issue. We are seeing intimidation of civil society actors. We are seeing governments, devising very creative, high-tech ways, to continue monitoring the activities of civil society organization. I think this is almost cutting across and is coming out as maybe a theme that we need to be very aware of. The other thing that I'm seeing is also the fact that most of the panelists appreciate that an active civil society is critical for a healthy rights-based society. And I think what we are seeing is that without civil society, again, there are so many things that go unchecked in society. So the role of civil society is still very key. It's really very important that despite the challenges that CSOs have to go through, we still have to maintain, an active civil society within the context that we work in. The other thing is that has come up in this is different ways in which we feel that civil societies can continue to be free and be heard, and it's really finding creative ways of remaining afloat and remaining relevant. I think some of the conversations that I had from these was very close collaboration between civil society and the media to get international attention to some of the issues that might be very specific to certain contexts. The other thing that we need again to be very aware of are the risks, because the governments are using a lot of intimidation and threats to the activists. How do we then try to ensure that civil society actors and others, are safe within those particular contexts? There are also creative ways. We've heard about things like Zoom protests. It's just about how do we still be able to mobilize critical masses, to bring issues, on the table, for further discussion and deliberation, so on. So I think CSOs are very, very key, and yeah, we just have to find creative ways, collaboration, working jointly, drawing lessons, sharing experiences, opportunities to be able to engage in platforms and forums like these to advance that agenda that really addresses issues to do with rights in the context that we work in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd really like to thank all participants for joining, for being interested in the subject, and also for sharing your comments and questions with us. And I feel as if this is a critical discussion, not just in relation to COVID-19 and how our governments respond, but for the foreseeable future. And as we've said, COVID-19 seems to exacerbate and spotlight some of the issues, but they've been present for a long time, and they need, active civil society to address some of these issues and try to protect its own space. So thanks for your interest, and thanks for engaging in this as a long-term effort. So I'd really like to thank Kennedy for that summary. I'd really like to thank Teresa, Ruki and Sahar for your fascinating presentations, and also for your responses to the questions. Thanks to Libby for taking notes, and thanks to Debbie for managing the chat. And as I've said, a big, big thank you to you for joining. I'd just like to say a little bit about American Friends Service Committee work at the moment, and we've made some reference to the Under the Mask programme of work, and this really is looking at this topic of restricted space and trying to develop strategies, tools, ways that we can address the restrictions. So this could be at a local level, national level, or internationally. We're looking at advocacy strategies. We're looking at accurate data that gives us a strong idea of where we need to advocate. And we're developing a website that hopefully will be a hub that brings a lot of this information together. It's currently under design, and our intention is to launch the website early in the new year. So if you'd like to join the launch, please follow the link in the chat. I think that Debbie's put it up, and you can register, and we'll keep you informed of our activities and how they develop, and we'll invite you to join the launch then. Also, please stay in touch and share any good examples that you encounter of effective civil society actions or strategies. We want to keep on focusing on this, and we want to be able to share effective strategies and practice. So that's my final message to you. Please stay in touch and keep sharing. And thank you very much indeed.